My name is Kelty Garbee, and I'm joined by my colleague, Evan Wolstencroft. So today, I'm going to run you through a few slides about Texas Rural Funders with some data and tools and information that we hope will be useful to you all. And then we've invited our colleague from a member organization, OneStar. So Taylor Wolter is bringing you what we hope is the best of a webinar that we did. But also he is very much an expert on disaster relief and disaster philanthropy at the state level. So we wanted to combine this resource from a member of Texas Rural Funders with our presentation about the grants and technical assistance. So my colleague Evan will be with you all in person next week. So we wanted you to be able to see his face on the screen, but you can meet him in real life next week. We are a nonprofit membership organization for funders. And as it says on the screen there, our mission is to mobilize the power of philanthropy to strengthen rural Texas. So foundations, grant-making organizations are members of Texas Rural Funders. We don't give grants ourselves, but we work with a lot of grant makers, and they provide resources through Texas Rural Funders to build things like grants hubs, or to create a grant writer list, which I'm going to talk to you a bit about today. So funders are busy learning and collaborating together through Texas Rural Funders. But one of the things we've realized in the years that we've been together is that we describe our jobs as air traffic controlling. And what that means is we're paying attention at the national and state levels in particular, but also when you all in rural communities and organizations bring things to our attention, we also try and broadcast that back out to the state level. And so on the screen, you see that we have a set of resources that are available to rural communities. So I'm going to start this morning by sharing some data from some national research and some lessons learned from working with funders in rural communities. We'll share a few rural resources, and then I'm going to hand it over to Taylor for the bulk of the presentation. So there's some statistics here. There's a great conference that I highly recommend. We work really closely with the Dallas Federal Reserve, but the Richmond Fed, the bulk of that region is rural, and they put on a rural conference every year. As you all know, and this is quite true in Texas as well, 20% of the population in the United States is rural. This statistic that 3% of all grants go to rural may feel sobering. But at Texas Rural Funders, we are very asset-based, and we focus on the connections between urban and rural communities. And so while that number is much lower than most of us here would like to see it, what that really means when you look at the 70% of funding to rural communities comes from urban, is the fact that many people in urban areas either came from rural areas, or the wealth of philanthropy is generated in rural areas. And so there are strong and active connections between urban and rural. One thing that I think we would like to see change is this ratio of loans to grants in rural communities. It's high, probably a little higher than we'd like to see. But we work with a set of funders that is very focused on bringing attention and resources to rural communities. So this slide is from a national study, and this idea of philanthropy's rural blind spot. I know, without even talking to you all, just listening to you talk about the water resolutions and the things that you all have been, that we all know you've been going through in the Hill Country recently, is that rural nonprofits are working hard all the time, and usually that's with fewer staff and smaller budgets than your urban counterparts. And as a result, many rural organizations fall into this invisible category here. And the idea is, are funders aware of the work that you're doing, the level of resources that you need? Our advice is to work to be visible, because funders can't support you if they don't know who you are. And this may be everything from applying for a grant to building partnerships or participating in technical assistance. So the idea is, and I know many of you all are in local government, but there's great examples from across the state in some of the other presentations that we do, and that you all may be aware of as well, of government, nonprofits, funders working together in public-private partnerships. And so the idea of being visible and funded, and doing the things that bring you to the attention of funders, it gives them an opportunity to say, yes, I want to work with you, or I want to support your mission. So when we were preparing our presentation, we talked about there's all kinds of things that we hear at the national level and sometimes even at the state level that are misperceptions about rural communities. And many of these may resonate with you, unfortunately. So this idea that capacity is low, as I said earlier, we know that you all are working harder with fewer staff members and resources. And so the way I would reframe it is that rural leaders are quite self-sufficient in many ways. We've often heard that balance sheets are too small. I administered grants at a state agency, and one thing that I was impressed with around rural grants is how well rural grantees often put those dollars to use. People say that there are not innovative projects. I would say that you're not looking in the right place if you can't find a rural project to fund, because there's a lot of great examples of rural innovation. You just have to know where to look. And then finally, this idea that the impact is too small. And again, I've seen rural communities take a $50,000 grant and use that in an amazing way compared to an urban counterpart. And it's not an us versus them, but fewer dollars do go to rural areas, and they can have a huge impact when they are sent to rural communities. So I'm going to talk you through a few of the resources that we offer on our website. The Grants Hub is a list of grants, federal, state, and private grants, and we update it every single month. And our thinking was, you all are working hard, and many rural nonprofits and even local governments don't have people dedicated to fundraising. And so what we're trying to help with is the prospect research to lift that burden. So we do update this every month. You can either search right on our website, or you can download it. And so there's a QR code here if you want to check it out. And I'll show you an image of it on the next slide. It is complemented by a roster of vetted grant writers. So you can go and download a list of individuals with experience. In particular, the list has people with experience writing government grants. We are doing another call, and we'll be adding some other areas of expertise. But as you can see, again, it's little boxes for each content area, and the hashtags show you how they're tagged. So when you, on the left side of the screen, it says programmatic area, each of the hashtags that you can see on the right are those different program areas. So you could say, I'm looking for workforce and economic development grants, and go look at all of them. And so we try and include the deadline and the grant range to make that a little bit easier. Sorry. Oh. What can you all see the?
We're on the Grants Hub snapshot, Kelty. I think
Okay.
next slide would be on the newsletter.
Okay. It has frozen somehow, so I'm going to work on I'm going to just stop sharing for one moment. And Evan, I'll let you talk about the newsletter while I fix up the slides.
Of course, Kelty. So, folks, as Kelty mentioned, our Grants Hub is updated monthly. It's searchable, but it's not the only resource that we're able to share on behalf of our philanthropic network with rural communities. We also have a monthly newsletter that we call the Roundup. That is a digest, not just of funding opportunities for rural, but really cool stories that we're getting from the field, other opportunities to connect with partners, attend technical assistance, connect with folks at conferences and events around the state. But something that we learned as we've built the newsletter and sent it out to folks every month is that in its totality, in the time that we've been running the newsletter, it's actually become a really wonderful resource library that we have also integrated into our website. And Kelty, I will actually hand it back to you to talk about some of the things that we talk about in our resources, like partnerships.
Great. So we have our newsletter. We also travel the state and get to do presentations to all types of organizations. I'm sharing two examples from different areas. So Brackettville reached out to have a conversation about water and the fact that there's no water in their pool. And as you all know, water is a sometimes contentious topic to work through in communities. And so they've been working with a coalition of the willing. And what they decided to do was some programming in the pool. And I love it that they lowered a piano into the pool to have a concert. And so the the person you see playing the piano is the lead of the group. People got excited. There's videos of people dancing in the pool. They decided to come back and do a separate program with somebody who's an expert on insects. And so they're building community participation around something that is a challenging aspect of their community work. So I wanted to share that example. We were out in West Texas last week at a Rural Philanthropy Day event, and we learned that a literacy organization was running out of places to store books, had a great idea to partner with the food bank and store books in the food bank. The food bank has people regularly coming to pick up boxes of food. They also have trucks doing deliveries. So they were actually able to expand the impact of both organizations by adding books to those boxes that people are receiving, whether they pick it up or it's delivered to their home, and getting some great storage space. So these are the kind of examples we invite you all to share with us. We put examples like that into our newsletter, and everything that's ever been in our newsletter goes to live on the rural resources portion of our website. And so I'll say before I hand it over to Taylor in just a moment that we really do invite you to share your stories because we will include them in our newsletter. If you're looking to write a grant, build a partnership, figure out how to make a project work better, this section of our website includes data, toolkits, jobs for rural communities that are hiring or if someone's looking. So that is really a dynamic part of our website. And so I would say there are 4 ways to engage with us. Send us your news, as I just described. We are happy to present. We wanted to give time over to Taylor, but we have more detailed presentations we can do for you. We have a webinar on disaster planning, and you're about to hear the best of that from Taylor. And then finally, check out our members on our website. And I'll hand it over to Taylor.
Right, fantastic. Thank you, Kelty, and good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor Wolter. I'm the Director of Philanthropy, Strategy, and Innovation at OneStar Foundation. OneStar is the state commission on national service, volunteerism, nonprofits, and disaster philanthropy for the state of Texas. We're also the supporting nonprofit to the Office of the Governor. In my role, I oversee all philanthropy initiatives of the foundation that include the Rebuild Texas Fund, which is the state-sponsored disaster philanthropy fund for the state of Texas. We're also the primary coordinating agency for philanthropic response to natural disasters, man-made disasters, and mass casualty events in the state of Texas. A little bit about my background. I've been in emergency management, nonprofit leadership for 15 years next year. Began as an AmeriCorps member back in the early 2010s. Before taking over one of the largest disaster response AmeriCorps programs in the country. Scaled that into a top-performing national model before coming on with OneStar in 2017, 2 weeks after Hurricane Harvey hit, where I led 3 federal task forces for the Department of Homeland Security and the Texas Division of Emergency Management, overseeing all volunteer, in-kind, and monetary donations, as well as long-term recovery, development, and operations for the storm. I now serve as a subject matter expert for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and TDEM in terms of all of those areas while leading the state's disaster fund. And so today, I really want to, I think just with everything that's going on, Kelty and Evan asked me to join and just kind of walk us through Disaster 101, provide some foundational level of knowledge around disasters, where they begin, where they end, the phases of emergency management. We're going to talk about the disaster declaration process from local, state, and federal. We'll also talk about the role of state and federal emergency management, as well as local emergency management in times of disaster. I want to discuss a little bit about a whole community approach to emergency management. This is a newer model that's been rolled out heavily in the last 5 to 7 years, and is the state emergency management approach in Texas under TDEM's new operation under Texas A&M University. And then we'll discuss a little bit of an overview of financial needs and resources pertaining to disaster. And so the first thing I really want to touch on here before we dive in is just I want to emphasize that all disasters begin and end locally. And so, as a community leader, whether you're an elected official, you run a community organization, always understanding that you're always going to be the first to experience the disaster and be the first responder when that happens. It will escalate to different levels, whether that be, the state level through TDEM, whether it gets a federal declaration through FEMA and the president's or the White House rather. And then it will always scale back down to the locality, to the most local level possible to oversee the long-term recovery, rebuild, and long-term community support after the disaster. So the first thing I want to talk about are the phases of emergency management. We call this the disaster continuum. It kind of encompasses all of the different phases. With the recent floods, I think this is very timely. We've just seen a transition change from response to recovery. And so I just wanted to talk this through so everyone has a full picture of kind of where we've been, where we're going, and this will apply to any disaster, not just the recent floods. So everything starts with preparedness. And these are going to be actions taken prior to an emergency to facilitate response and promote readiness. So thinking about what will we do if a disaster hits? Again, this is a wide range. At OneStar, about 3 years ago, we've always classified disasters as natural and man-made, and we felt the need, given the continuing evolution of events we see, things like derechos, other new weather events, to broaden that to be unexpected challenge or unexpected events impacting Texans. Our fund was established, and most of our operations have been established around hurricanes and flooding. In recent years, we have responded to the Uvalde school shooting. We were the money coordinator for the Uvalde event. Also responded to COVID-19, who saw a global pandemic coming stateside in the United States. And really are just preparing. In Texas, we have the ability to experience any type of disaster except for glacial events, because we don't have any glaciers, and volcanic events, because we don't have any volcanoes that we know of yet. But everything else is on the table in the state of Texas. And so wanted to broaden that out just, to encompass anything that could happen. And so preparedness is really thinking about what will we do when a disaster strikes? How are we going to handle that? What are our plans going to be? And trying to be as prepared as possible, also knowing that you can never be fully prepared. Every disaster is different, even if you have 2 floods, in years back to back. They're going to be very different disasters, but doing your best to think about, what do we have in our community? How will we engage that? How will we respond? What will that look like? Who will be in charge of what? Who are going to be our key players? And what are our support mechanisms going to be there? Then once the disaster happens, we move into the response phase. This is what I always like to tell folks is kind of referred to as like the sexy phase of disaster, where, we have helicopters and search and rescue. It's the piece that's all over the news, that really tugs on the heartstrings of everyone. And what everybody thinks of, everybody thinks that's the entire disaster. And that once, our helicopters and our boats and our search and rescue teams and FEMA and everybody goes home, that it's all done. What we've recently experienced in the Hill Country and Central Texas specifically after the recent floods is a transition from the response phase to the recovery phase of disaster. And this is a really critical junction in disaster management and something that I want to just do a little bit of education on today. There's two different phases when we talk about recovery. There is short-term recovery, and then there's long-term recovery. And so when we think about short-term recovery, as soon as we transition out of, everyone is safe, secure, the storm has ended, the waters have receded, search and rescue has wrapped, we move into recovery. And the initial goal of short-term recovery is going to be to, get our critical services back online. So thinking, the electric grid, water treatment plants, triaging our public infrastructure, so roads, bridges, ensuring that we have, access to every corner of our community, and that folks are able to sustain with those critical services. Internet is another one these days. We consider that critical infrastructure now. Making sure that all of these services are back online for folks, who do need, or for everyone who needs them, and allow us to move into the long-term recovery, which is where we're going to focus heavily on case management of survivors and impacted individuals and rebuilding efforts after the storm, both, getting folks back into safe, sanitary, and secure housing and thinking about resilience building. And then mitigation is something we think about kind of after we're done with an event around like how can we mitigate to prevent the impacts from being, as severe as they were in the previous disaster. And something that, that'll be a period that we transition to over a long period of time. And then just in terms of estimating each phase of disaster recovery, we use the rule of 10. So understanding that starting with response, however long response takes, we can assume that each phase after that, so short-term recovery and then long-term recovery, will take 10 times longer than the stage that preceded it. So if we've got a response that takes 1 month, we can assume that short-term recovery will take 10 months, meaning that long-term recovery will take an estimated 100 months or 8 years. It's not an exact formula, but it gets us pretty close to understanding our long-term needs and what the timeline is going to be for recovery. Now, I want to move into the disaster declaration process. This is something that, it's not very well publicized. And so this is, how everything would happen in a perfect world, understanding there are intricacies to every disaster. And, it may not always work exactly in this path, but this is, in a perfect world, how we like to see it happen. So we have the disaster occurs, the flood, the tornado, whatever it may be. Our county judge will immediately declare a local disaster once they know that there is a disaster event going. And an emergency versus a disaster is an important distinction here. So an emergency is generally something that can be handled in 72 hours or less. A disaster is something that tracks for longer than 72 hours and has long-term implications for those involved. Once the county judge declares the local disaster, we often see that local resources become overwhelmed. Outside of, our major metro areas, especially when we're talking about rural Texas, we often, we may have an emergency management director that reports to the judge and kind of oversees the emergency management process. In a lot of instances, we have someone who may be like the fire chief who also, has a dual role as the emergency management coordinator, doesn't have a staff. And so it's very easy for those local resources to become overwhelmed. Once that happens, the county judge will then request a state declaration of disaster from the Texas governor's office. So this is our first escalation. We move from city-county level to the state. Once the governor declares the disaster, he will either declare or deny it. In Texas, Governor Abbott is very responsive and understands that we live in the most disaster-prone state in the country. For reference, we outpaced California over the last 50 years by over 100 federally declared disaster events. Because of that, Governor Abbott is generally very responsive to issuing these state declarations, and I haven't seen him deny almost any of them in the last 15 years. Once he approves that disaster declaration at the state level, state emergency management, or the Texas Division of Emergency Management, TDEM, as we're all probably aware, will deploy its resources to support the local municipality. This includes coordinating preliminary damage assessments. That's the first step that's needed for a potential federal declaration to the president. And they'll provide consulting and capacity building for local emergency management in critical areas that are necessary. They come with a very well time-tested playbook, and come in and help roll out all of the infrastructure, support, and consulting services that are necessary to assist the city or county in responding to the disaster that they're handling. If we reach a point, which, this is in Texas, we're very good at dealing with things at the state level, but it does happen, and we've seen it with the Hill Country floods, that state resources also can become overwhelmed, and or a damage threshold is met. So in Texas, in order to request a federal declaration from the federal government, we have to prove a certain damage threshold. It's not an exact number, but it's somewhere in the range of $59 million of verified damage that was caused by the storm or the disaster event. Once we meet either that threshold or state resources become overwhelmed, the governor requests a federal declaration from via the FEMA regional office, which is located. I'm here in Denton in North Texas, which is also where the FEMA Region 6 office is. That covers New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Once it is approved by the FEMA office, it will then be sent to the White House for approval and signature by the president. Once the president issues that, there are two types of federal declarations that we receive. One is an emergency declaration, which is a lower level federal declaration and comes with a limited scope of resources available. The other is a major disaster declaration, and this is basically where all the cards are on the table from FEMA. This will include individual assistance, public assistance, in certain instances, sheltering assistance through the TSA program, and will be kind of a rollout of the full scope of federal support. Okay, now I want to walk us through the different levels of emergency management, do a little bit of myth busting here. I think it's really important as community leaders to understand the different roles that the different agencies play. And I want to dispel a few myths because there's a lot of misconceptions about who provides what in times of disaster. So we'll start with the local emergency management. So this will be your city and or the county emergency management agencies. They are housed within the city and county government. In the state of Texas, we are a home ruled state, meaning that each county has a county judge who is the highest elected official in the county. And the county judge for every county in the state of Texas is the assigned emergency management director for that county. Oftentimes, like I said, they will employ an emergency management director or an emergency management coordinator that kind of oversees the day-to-day operations because, it is a very specialized field, and you often do need that subject matter expertise to oversee those day-to-day operations. But the county judge is the ultimate decision maker. The buck stops with them as far as decisions about anything having to do with an emergency or disasters. And then the other important thing is to understand that these are the first and last line of response for any individual community. So they're the first ones to respond, and they will be the last ones there kind of overseeing the response and all of the community efforts for the long term once all the other support agencies go home. Slide. Okay, so then we escalate to the state emergency management level here. And so in Texas, that's going to be the Texas Division of Emergency Management. They're housed at Texas A&M University, and they're what you can essentially think of as our state level FEMA. They come in and support local governments when resources become overwhelmed. Their support must be requested by the county judge and directed by the governor to engage, so they can only be engaged by the governor's office. And they deploy in a consulting and capacity building role for local government. A common misconception with state emergency management is that they provide financial or material resources to disaster survivors. And in the state of Texas, that is false. They are simply capacity building for that local agency. We don't see financial or material resources being deployed until we reach the federal level, which we'll talk about here next. Okay, so the ultimate level of disaster, once we've reached all the thresholds, everyone's become overwhelmed, FEMA will get involved. FEMA's housed under the Department of Homeland Security. They support state governments when resources become overwhelmed. And a lot of times you'll see this, they support the state government, that's how it's written into statute. However, they will come in and they also support the local municipalities in partnership with the State Emergency Management Agency. They must be requested by the governor and approved by the president to engage. And again, there are those different levels of disaster declarations, as well as rollouts of individual assistance and public assistance. Just because you have a disaster declaration does not mean necessarily that you get both. There are different thresholds that have to be met for individual assistance and public assistance. IA, or individual assistance, is focused on survivors, those that have lost their homes, those that have perished from an event, and providing financial resources to those individuals. Public assistance is for infrastructure that was damaged after the disaster and is funding that is provided to local governments. Generally, with FEMA involvement in a storm, there is a 25-75 cost share. So FEMA covers 75% of the cost of the response, while the state is on the line for 25%. There are certain instances like Hurricane Harvey, where we had a period of time where FEMA came in at 100% with zero cost share to the state and transitioned to a 75-25 after a certain period. That's generally reserved for only the most extreme weather events with widespread damage. And is put into place to keep cities and counties from going and states from going bankrupt. Now we're going to talk about a whole community approach here, which is a newer approach to emergency management. So traditionally and historically speaking, emergency management has kind of been like a czar type model where the emergency management director, emergency management coordinator is the czar of the disaster, oversees and directs all aspects of the disaster, and is responsible for everything. Volunteer management, recovery, response, the whole, donations management, the whole piece. A whole community approach is a new way of thinking about emergency management, and the goal of it is to leverage the residents, the emergency managers, organization and community leaders, and government officials to leverage all resources within a community and help everyone within the community, whether they are in the emergency space or not, understand what their role is in times of disaster, build those relationships, and be ready and prepared to activate the full community infrastructure to support all aspects of community need after a disaster. The goal here is to, kind of bring the cross sector and full community into the fold. And that includes everyone from your nonprofits, your private businesses, your faith-based sectors, disability organizations, even the general public. We've got tribes in certain parts of the state of Texas, and then all levels of government to support with whatever strengths they may have to support us so that the emergency management office and the local government is not fully responsible for filling every need. And then at that point, the emergency management coordinator becomes just that, a coordinator that is coordinating the full community's, scope of resources to better meet the needs of those that are impacted. Slide. Okay, so an overview of financial needs and resources. So total disaster expense can be broken down into two macro categories. There's short-term factors and long-term factors. Short-term factors, we're thinking that response, the initial cost to conduct our search and rescue, our initial cost to shelter folks, and any of those other immediate resources. Our long-term factors are thinking more towards that community stabilization after, the waters have receded, the storm moves on, as well as those long-term rebuilding and mitigation and resilience factors. So our first line contributors to financial stability and to cover this expense are going to be federal support like FEMA and SBA. So FEMA comes in with their grant-making programs for public and individual assistance. A lesser-known support agency that is a very critical player is the Small Business Administration. They have a disaster lending program that actually allows them to lend to individuals for things like emergency like mortgage assistance and other areas. So it's not just for small businesses, although they do have a program as well for businesses impacted by disaster. We have state and local government that can bring in infrastructure and services. So if we need help getting our roads and bridges back online, repairing water treatment facilities, getting the electric grid back online, we have state agency resources that can come in and support that. Again, there is no, financial support there, but they do have the, skill capacity to bring in those services generally at no cost to support immediate recovery for a community. We've got private insurance, and this fills the needs of survivors and individuals. Um, I do want to be clear here that most folks in these situations find themselves underinsured. And so when we'll see kind of a collaboration here of how that gets met. And then nonprofits that can provide survivor and individual needs. So nonprofits fill all of the gaps that are missed by everyone else generally. That'll be from services such as debris management, um, and muck and gut services, all the way to financial assistance for survivors in terms of gift cards and donations operations, managing in-kind donations to get survivors the immediate resources they need. Um, and they'll play a role both in the immediate and the response as well as the long term. And then the unmet needs we see rise from federal assistance. So a full award from FEMA is very rare. But if it occurs and you've lost everything and you're awarded a full award from FEMA, currently that is valued at $43,600. So a mid-range, Toyota Camry is the total amount of money you're going to get if you've lost everything, you're completely uninsured. It's not going to get you very far. Again, many people find themselves underinsured, especially for floods. We see a lot of floods in parts of the state where folks are not in a floodplain. Significant, aerial flooding event happens. They get flooded. They don't have flood insurance. It's not covered by their homeowner's insurance. We also see this a lot with vegetative debris. You may be fully insured and be able to, recover your home, but if you've got a tree that fell through your house, most insurance plans will not cover the removal of vegetative debris from a residential structure. And then state and local governments have limited resources available, and it's becoming less and less every year. And so it leaves us with a larger and larger unmet need. All right, now let's talk about philanthropy's role in disaster and kind of how we meet some of these needs. So philanthropy is largely responsible for filling the unmet needs gap. So after all of the federal resources have been deployed, everything else has been deployed, we have a huge unmet need. For Hurricane Harvey specifically, our unmet need was somewhere in the range of $2 billion. And or I'm sorry, 200 billion, excuse me, which was massive. And so this will include direct survivor benefits that philanthropy can fill, as well as funding for organizations supporting survivor recovery with things like emergency unmet needs, case management, and home rebuild. So fundraising for disasters. If you lead an agency that does fundraising and find yourself in a situation, as the Community Foundation of the Texas Hill Country did, where now you are responsible for, fundraising for a disaster in your community, you have to understand that the giving window for disasters is incredibly small. And this is also something as a community leader to be aware of and to plan for ahead of time, because you will have a massive unmet need regardless of the scale of the disaster, and you have to rely on private fundraising and philanthropy to fill that unmet needs gap that remains. And so identifying a community organization, whether that be a United Way, a community foundation, even a church who has fundraising capacity and is a 501c3, can be a great partner in planning ahead to make sure that you capture the fundraising dollars when they are available while you're in the 15 minutes of public attention from a disaster. So this is from very respected research in the philanthropy space, but 30% of individual giving is done within 3 to 4 weeks. That's incredibly consistent with what we experienced at the Rebuild Texas Fund as far as giving intensity after an event. 60% of giving happens within 2 months, and giving stops completely within 5 to 6 months. And this is a best case scenario, with a more realistic number being between 2 to 4 months. As the news cycle moves on, the world is crazy. We do see, folks, the attention span is very short. And so we have to capture that as quickly as possible to ensure that we're, capturing all that we can to help our communities after disasters.
Taylor, thank you for that amazing speed round of lessons learned and resources. So you all are going to receive these slides. So we wanted to just share kind of the key takeaways from this presentation. There's also a resource that Evan should have dropped in the chat or is going to if he hasn't already. So where we pulled places to look for funding to find connections to some of the state agencies and things like that. So again, we thank you for your time. And we're happy to answer any questions here or offline if it's useful. So